Welcome, everybody, to Congregation Va-Dor. We're in Boynton Beach, Florida, and tonight is July 19th, and we are pleased to present Touch of Torah with a touch of music with Andy Susman, our educator and Cantorial Spiritual Leader, and he will be leading us tonight on our study of Pinchas, one of the final chapters in the book of Numbers. Take it away, Andy.
Okay, well, as always, I like to open up with a medley of Torah tunes, and this will bring back memories of Cheder. Al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, al shlosha devarim, ha'olam omed. The whole world stands on three things. The whole world stands on three things. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilud chasadim. On Torah and on prayer and on deeds of loving kindness. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov. Torah, tziva lanu Moshe. Israel, Israel, ve'oraita chadhu, Torah, ora, Torah, ora, hallelujah. Torah, ora, Torah, ora, hallelujah. And I have one specific for the study of the actual study of Torah, the prayer la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are commanded to immerse ourselves in the study of Torah. This melody is by Dan Nichols. He is one of the newer people in the progressive Jewish music scene, but he's not that new. He's been around for over 20 years, but for an old timer like me, I guess he's newer. So his melody goes like this: Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddishanu B'mitzvotav v'tzivanu La'asok b'divrei Torah La'asok b'divrei Torah. Sweet as honey, sweet as honey, sweet as honey on our tongue. Sweet as honey, sweet as honey, sweet as honey on our tongue. And I'll go one more, an oldie but a goodie. And this is really popular in the Reform movement. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. You could clap it. Happy, it is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. Shalom, 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 shalom. Well, thank you for that. I always like opening with a little music. So I want to screen share, but before I do that, if you want to all unmute, if anybody wants to share something that they have already prepared, some thoughts on the portion, or if you want me just to screen share, we're going to begin reading some commentaries and discussion. So anybody have some opening comments to set us off? Okay. Well, there are plenty of inspiring commentaries available, and perhaps Sharon, I'll try to get out to Sharon early next week's commentaries so you can read in advance, and that way it won't be last minute. But okay, so let me screen share this. And there it is, and there it goes. Okay, so let's see here, move that over there. Oh, that's kind of in the way. Let's see if we can move it somewhere. All right, I'll scroll. All right, well, for starters, there's this Hebrew named Zelophehad, and those of you who know Hebrew, if you look at the Hebrew, there's a chet in there, but most of the transliterations do not put a ch. They just pronounce it as an h, which is obviously not correct. So it's not even a z. It's like it's a tzadi. It's Zelophehad. Anyway, so long story short, toward the end of the portion, they talk about Zelophehad and his daughters who survived him, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. So this story begins in last week's portion, and I'm going to ask someone to volunteer, maybe a newbie. Mary, would you unmute? And I'm going to ask you to read. So just start there in last week's Torah portion. Go for it.
In last week's Torah portion, Parashat Balak, Pinchas sent a spear through an Israelite and a Midianite woman simply because they were having a relationship. In this week's portion, the title of which indicates the esteem in which the rabbi held him, Pinchas' reward is described. He is placed in line for the priesthood. While I understand that documentary critics of the Torah explain the political reasons for such an action, I am still stuck with this message, as even if it is edited into the text.
So hang on one second. Let me give credit where credit's due. The title is called The Pinchas Problem, and this is Rabbi Kerry Olitsky. He's been around for quite a while, very inspiring thought expositor on Torah. Okay, so keep reading. Sometimes
the crux of the problem of the portion just sticks in my gut, and I can't seem to find its transcendent message. Sure, any Torah portion has many things to say, and I could easily avoid its primary lesson. And I recognize the teaching of my youth about not turning a text into a pretext for saying something else. The message of this parsha, which begins in last week's Torah portion, is worsened in this week's reading.
Okay, let me jump in there. However, okay, next reader, Alan, would you jump in?
However, it seems that not everyone is happy with Pinchas's actions nor his reward. Immediately thereafter, a census is taken of the people, presumably once again to determine the readiness of the people for war. Are they really prepared to stand behind Moses? Were they chastened by Pinchas's actions? Were they emboldened by the acts and its rewards? It is clear that the Torah text is implying that the census is meant to appraise the disposition of the people after such actions. The long listing of the various clans seems to be included to indicate who supported the action or who was indeed prepared to take conquest of the land.
You may go and finish it.
But then comes the final story in this narrative, an insertion of the plight of the daughters of Zelophehad. In this oft-reported case, Zelophehad dies without sons. Thus, there is no one in the family to legally inherit his land and belongings. His daughters make a plea that they should be entitled to their father's estate. Moses brings their case before God, and God rules in favor of the 5 women. This decision established an important precedent in Jewish law that has been cited for generations by those who see gender equality in Judaism.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to jump in real quick. It is clear to me, this is Kerry speaking, that there is a connection between these 3 stories. The last one is introduced to soften our judgment against Moses and God, as if to say, well, maybe they aren't so bad. After all, look how they supported the daughters of Zelophehad. I realize that we can't expect to approve of all the actions contained in an ancient saga about our group's journey to become a people. But I also realize that even if we were we agree that sometimes the ends can justify the means, we don't have to simply accept what is contained in the text. That's why we have these discussions. That's why there's commentaries upon commentaries and so forth. And the last, in bold and black, Ron Ames, there are still, go for it.
Call from 607.
Nope, guess not. There are still those among
Ron?
us who...
No, Ron's there.
Okay, Ron, you jump in. There are still those?
There are still those among us who applaud Pinchas' actions, even if they would shy away from such a violent approach. Nonetheless, their underlying attitudes are the same. And if we are to be a people that welcomes in the stranger, as it teaches us in the same Torah that retells the story of Pinchas, then such attitudes have to change.
Okay, now you notice I bolded that, enlarged the font in that last sentence. If we are to be a people that welcomes in the stranger, as it teaches us, that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, we have to change this dynamic. So we're gonna lean in on that in a minute, but I'm gonna zip all the way down. You're gonna see what I did. We got a lot of cool stuff coming, but before I jump back, I want to jump to the portion, the end of last week's portion. So I like Jeff Igus. Would you please read? There are 9 verses. Would you please read the last 9 verses of Balak that are the pretext for this week's portion? Go for it.
Okay. And Israel stayed in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And Israel attached himself to Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them up before the Lord in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, slay you every one his men who were attached to Baal Peor. And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought to his brothers a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the people of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tent of meeting. And when Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand, and fell into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague ceased from the people of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000.
24,000. Very bloody. The Torah is not a PG-13 body of text. It's serious mayhem. So, okay. So let's move back a little bit to. So if we open up the first few verses, so this guy Pinchas is rewarded for supposedly stopping this outrage. Now they call it a plague. Was it an actual plague of a disease, or was it a plague of a lack of leadership or conviction to follow the laws? That's another question. So so what I did was I divided up the Torah portion by sections. The first section here is the main one. So Pinchas' reward. And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, and the anglicized version of Pinchas is Phineas. But that's not I saw Jeff immediately use the Hebrew. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the people of Israel, while he was zealous for my sake, that I consume not the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore I say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. Now imagine that. Violently kills this couple, and yet supposedly that staved off any further slaughtering, and so he was a peacemaker. Interesting. And the name of the Israelite who was slain, who was slain with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, the prince of a father's house among the Simeonites. or Shimonites. And the name of the Midianite woman was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was chief over the people of a father's house in Midian. Okay, so you had this violent attack, this graphic situation, and supposedly that was the end. So we just took a look at the the commentary by Kerry Olitsky, and the essence of that was that we need to rethink how we applaud certain actions if we truly want to endorse the value of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so let's look at another commentary that really leans in on that discussion. And this is Rabbi Ismar Shorsh. Okay, so this is rather interesting. So I'm going to fast forward this. In 1962, Rabbi Schwartz graduated rabbinic school. He was as a newly minted rabbi. He was stationed at Fort Dix in New Jersey in the army. A year later, he was sent overseas to serve in Korea. And that was, of course, after the Korean War, the DMZ and whatnot. But while he was there for a year, he had a situation, and I'm going to ask someone else to read. So let's see. Sharon, you have all the names. So who wants to read Outside the Door?
Probably Stanley.
Stanley.
Stanley would love to read.
Outside the door paced an agitated, well-dressed gentleman in civilian clothes, looking for a Jewish chaplain. I revealed my identity all too quickly and smugly. My second mistake. In the office I would occupy for less than a year, the Army would reward my stellar work at Fort Dix by sending me to Korea. He unloaded on me an impassioned account about his daughter, who was going to marry a young Greek in basic training at Fort Dix. I couldn't tell exactly whether the father, a wealthy man from Connecticut, was furious because the kid was Christian or because he was poor and uneducated. In fact, the father suspected the young man of seeking to marry his daughter for her money. He insisted that I call the kid to disabuse him of his folly. And I, by now floundering in my inexperience, reluctantly agreed. To my surprise, the young man came when I summoned him and turned out to be good-looking and charming. Despite great discomfort, I carried out my futile task and never heard from him or his nemesis again. In retrospect,
go on, keep going. All right, go on, keep going.
In retrospect, my baptism by fire foreshadowed the engulfing crisis of Jewish continuity in our day.
So pause right there. And I put it in highlights. The engulfing crisis is this quote unquote intermarriage. That's where this article's going. And so let's have another reader. Mary Sharon, can you call someone else?
Gloria, would you like to read? Let me unmute you. Hold on, Gloria. Can you? Okay, go ahead, Gloria.
Where do I start? In retrospect?
Can Jews?
And right after the yellow.
I see it. Can Jews as individuals avail themselves of the unlimited opportunities of American society and still preserve their group identity? Are the twin goals of integration and survival compatible? As so often, the Torah relates to our predicament. The end of last week's Torah portion, Parshat Balak, and the opening of this week's deal with an early instance of integration integration. After 40 years, a renewed nation of Israel finds itself primed for the conquest of the promised land from the territory of Moab in the west. Alarmed, Balak, the king of Moab, calls on the Gentile soothsayer Balaam to thwart Israel with his curses. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed indeed, and he whom you curse is cursed.
Okay, so
Numbers-
pause right there. So last week's portion, Balaam the sorcerer was hired to curse the Israelites, and it didn't go so well. He could not actually bring himself to curse because God himself said, you shall not curse them. So what ends up happening is that Balak and Balaam part ways. However, you're going to see what comes up in a minute. So before we continue, as I was reading this, I was a little miffed by the word Moab in the west. So let me read that again. After 40 years, a renewed nation of Israel finds itself primed for the conquest of the promised land from the territory of Moab in the west. What's wrong with that? Moab is in the east. So I took a moment to grab some maps, and you will see that the west coast of Israel is kind of like the west coast of the United States. It's California. The ocean is where the sun sets. So basically, the east is where Moab is. Anyway, so there's a map just for the edification. So what happens is the Israelites left Egypt. They circled around the Sinai. And then when they made their entrance into the promised land, they swung around and they entered from the east side of the Jordan, crossing over, quote unquote, the West Bank. The West Bank is on the west side of the Jordan, but the West Bank, in juxtaposed to Israel and the Green Line, is east of Israel. You all know that. Okay, there's a little geography there. Okay, let's keep going. But Balaam is overwhelmed. Okay, back to that relationship between Balaam and Balak. Even though Balak and Balaam were at odds about what was requested of him, Balaam wanted to get his remuneration. So he did advise Balak what to do. Here we go. But Balaam is overwhelmed by the singular beauty of Israel's individuality. He recognizes therein the hope of humanity, a new, far purer, more wholesome nationhood. Try as he might to curse, he can only sing its praise. Okay. And who wants to read? Somebody new. Sharon, pick somebody.
I can read. Where do you
Go
want
for
me?
it. There is a people.
There is a people that dwells apart, not reckoned among the nations. No harm is in sight for Jacob, no woe in view for Israel. Lo, there is no augury in Jacob, no divining in Israel. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel.
So there's the Matovu. Just for a little color, I'm going to sing that for you right now. And there's different melodies, but we'll try this one. Matov, Matov, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, Matov, Matov, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael. So I offer that beautiful melody and text because at the closing swan song of the relationship between Balak and Balaam, Balaam says to Balak, hey, dude, there's still a way. There's still a way for you to undermine and break down the Israelites. If you let I can't curse them outright. But if you let your women fraternize with them, then you will see success and you'll weaken them. Well, sure enough, we now see 24,000 were killed in this conflagration or this outrage, however you want to describe it. So,
Andy, was those 24,000 amongst Israelites and the Moabites?
well, that's a good question. I think the numbers were primarily focused on the Hebrews that were slaughtered because it was the Hebrews who were weak. And yeah, of course, there were probably more than even that. I don't see, the thing was, they took a census thereafter, and maybe they had a census before, so they can do the math, and that's how they realized there were 24,000, the before and after.
Well,
That's one of the reasons.
Is the beginning of Numbers.
No, but I'm saying is another census is done.
Yeah.
See, after that big slaughter, they did another census because a lot of people were lost. So they had to do a redress to say, okay, well, how many are left? Anyway, so that's crazy stuff. But anyway, so to Balaam, the young Israel appears like, right, and then it goes, yet the very next episode, I just mentioned what Balaam did. Balaam advises him to erode Israel's apartness. Socializing will lead to intermarriage and apostasy, as we now see. So, we continue. Thus, the Torah recounts the romance of one mixed couple flaunted in full view. In Moses' conspicuous absence from this turn of events, another sign of his growing weariness or of inner conflict springing from his marriage to Zipporah. Once again, it's not a Z, it's a tzadi, Zipporah. Herself a Midianite. So Moses is kind of laying low because he's not quite sure how to address this situation because he himself is suspect in terms of intermarriage. Okay. The leadership vacuum, so here we are. The leadership vacuum is filled by Pinchas, grandson of Aaron, who on his own kills the offending couple, halting the plague. Back to that 24,000. Okay. In gratitude, God rewards him with the priesthood. Okay. So, need a new reader? Who wants to jump in? The Midrash. Pick someone new.
Valerie or Dr. Brooks, would you like to read? Valerie, you want to read?
I'm afraid it's a little small for me to see.
Okay.
I will make it larger. I make it larger.
Valerie, I called on Valerie first, so yeah. Where do you want Valerie to start?
The Midrash.
Okay. The Midrash detects in the words of the opening story, Vayeshev, settle down. Let me just get you out of the way, hold it. A touch of paradox. When Israel settled down at Shittim, the people profaned themselves by whoring with Moabite women. Overtly, the verb suggests the end of a taxing journey, the delicious anticipation of a long and undisturbed rest. But, declares Rabbi
Yochanan.
In truth, wherever the Torah uses the verb vayeshev, the narrative that follows is filled with anguish and turmoil. For example, Jacob returns to settle down the vayeshev in the land where his father had lived, in the land of Canaan. After an arduous absence of 21 years in the house of Laban, what follows is hardly the respite he sought and deserved, but the bitter envy of his sons towards Joseph.
Okay, I'll keep reading. Similarly, oh wait, hang on. Dr. Brooks, you want to jump in? Similarly.
Sorry, I'm juggling things here. Let me get to where I can see it well. Similarly. I've got an outline. I've got, oh, there it is. It's similarly, sorry about that. Israel arrived at Shittim to rest prior to invading Canaan and not to become entangled with the women of Moab. How often the course of events makes mockery of our hopes.
Okay, so hang on one second. I'll let you continue. So basically, this commentary talks about the intermarriage component. What is it about America that is the challenge for the Jewish people? And I'll just quickly say, you're all here as progressive Jews, and so people that are Orthodox or even conservative feel that they're the bridgehead against intermarriage, and they look askance at the more progressive Judaisms that may end up having larger migration or integration with assimilating. And so that's a challenge for me because I find that progressive Judaism is much more vibrant. However, we can't disregard that component of assimilation. Dr. Brooks, continue.
I was going to say that line, that last line that I read, reminded me. I think it was Einstein's quote about man plans and the universe laughs.
Good
kind
point.
of very similar.
Absolutely.
Very similar thing, yeah.
Well, I loved how Rabbi Schwartz mentioned the idea of Vayeshev and settled, because nothing was settled. Everything's unsettled. That seems to be.
Right.
It's a foreboding.
Yes.
Keep going.
Is America any different? Here too, Jews came filled with the sentiments of
Vayeshev
to escape the antipathy and constrictions of a conflicted continent, where even the advocates of emancipation for Jews despised Judaism. Nor did this country fail us. Since the Second World War, it has surely afforded Jews a measure of individual opportunity and collective freedom unprecedented in Jewish history. But will equality and prosperity be our undoing? Does the term Vayeshev still carry the ominous ring of disaster? The escalating incident of intermarriage is already decimating our ranks. What communal strategy can secure our collective identity without giving up on our individual equality?
All right, thank you, Doctor. Let me kind of jump in here. Let's see here. So, Rabbi Schwartz goes on and clarifies what his solution is. So, once again, this is through a lens of the Torah portion. You had Pinchas zealously take that spear, and these two people were just, for lack of a different term, toasted. And as a symbol, this will end now. And so that's why he's rewarded. There had been all sorts of stuff going on. So I can't, in the context of what had preceded that event, I don't blame Pinchas necessarily. However, the problem is how we dance with relations with the other. How do we interact effectively, simpatico, with others? And that's a really, charged question. But let's go through Schorisch's commentary quickly. So for most American Jews, a flight back into the seclusion of the ghetto is unacceptable, and this act of zealotry by Pinchas is not going to be helpful. We can't behave in such a vengeful manner, and we can't put ourselves in a bubble. We are in a modern world, and for most of us, we want to interact with the other. So he says, permit me to close with a concise formulation. I'm not going to read this verbatim. I'm going to summarize it. First, I believe that if our children end up marrying non-Jews, we should not reject them. We have to find a way to welcome them and allow our children, who of course usually are adults when they make this decision, to respect their decision. Many of us, myself included, we've been married and divorced. I can tell you I married a Jew the first time. I dated many Jews after, and so forth. But I right now have a non-Jewish girlfriend. So my metric for the other is a mensch. Is the other person a mensch, not necessarily Jewish? And so that's important. And as long as you support each other's journey. Second, we should not miss an opportunity to give the non-Jewish spouse, whether son or daughter, a chance to savor the Jewish experience. As a matter of fact, and Sharon's aware of this, on Friday, Rabbi Barry, Cantor Carroll, and myself participated in a paneling of a convert. And they had been married. This couple had been married for a number of years, but the spouse just now formally converted. And all that time, the in-laws were very welcoming. And so after this journey, she decided now's the time to cross over. So once again, the idea is create a loving environment so that the other might see Judaism in a positive light and embrace it. And then third, in the midst of our confusion and pain, we should not ask of Judaism to adopt measures that do violence to its integrity. So once again, we want to celebrate those parts of Judaism that we ourselves find endearing. We don't want to be harsh and overly rule-bearing. And I don't know how many of us here keep kosher. I'm sure many of us probably do not. So many of those rules that had turned off the Goyim to Judaism, that many of us do not uphold ourselves, might the values of Judaism to come to the fore and make adopting a Jewish identity much easier. Okay, so the last paragraph, Sharon, would you please pick someone else? And finally.
Ellen, you want to read again? I unmuted you.
Thank you. And finally, long before intermarriage takes place, we need to deepen the Jewish consciousness of our children. If we can extend their study of Judaism beyond bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, enlarge and enhance the Jewish teaching profession, build more Jewish day schools, and enrich the curriculum of our afternoon schools, expand the opportunities for informal Jewish education in Israel, at camp, and in youth movements, and above all, turn our home into a venue of holiness. We will dispose our youngsters to seek a Jewish mate, and short of that, to expect of their non-Jewish mate to become a Jew by choice. With sufficient pride and knowledge, they will not long abandon us or Judaism. In sum, where external barriers no longer exist to separate us from our neighbors, we must cultivate inner resources to offset the pull of complete assimilation.
Okay, so Rabbi Schwartz is definitely speaking from a conservative, more traditional angle, but of course he's on staff with Jewish JTS, and I think he's the dean of the JTS. So let me keep scroll down a little more. Let's see what's next. Oh, that's okay. The actual portion. Okay, so let me stop screen share and we can chat a little bit. Hang on. Let's see. I got to move this. Good luck. How do I do that? Oh, there we go. We're back. Okay. So I want to play one more song and then we're going to chat a little bit. You can share your thoughts. I had shared with you that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, is what was referenced in those two commentaries. So the Hebrew would go like this. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kahamocha, ze klal gadol b'Torah. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kahamocha, ze klal gadol b'Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. The greatest pearl of the Torah's wealth. Love your neighbor as yourself. The greatest pearl of the Torah's wealth. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kahamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so let's have a little roundtable discussion. You're welcome to, just raise your hand, then I'll call your name, and you can just jump in. Ron Ames, let's see what you got to say. Ron, and followed by Mary.
I have a question. I'm trying to understand the unacceptability of intermarriage that we're dealing with in this context. I presume it implies that if there was a conversion, then it would be acceptable. Is that a correct presumption?
Yes. Now, I'm going to throw something out just for, information. The Torah was originally the 4 books of Moses. And what happened was, because the journey was so convoluted and the people just were not abiding by the edicts, within the 5th book, for starters, you have the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, which doesn't appear anywhere else. And so it's a reiteration of some of the undertones of what they were hoping people would abide by, but just weren't. And so it's kind of like a redux of like once again, Deuteronomy, a second telling. So there you have it. So here the tumult in Numbers was met in Deuteronomy by Moses, gave three, not one, not two, but three farewell addresses, imploring the Hebrews or the Israelites, get with the program. Now, by then, Moses clearly knew he wasn't going to the promised land, but he still was committed to the mission. Okay. Anything else, Ron?
Thank you.
Okay. Mary?
I am a convert. My grandmother was from Panama, and she told me when I was about 5 that her family left Spain when the Jews left. Well, it took me till I was 65 to go, oh, I think I understand what she's saying. So I asked a friend of mine who's Jewish what I should do. I had this like aha moment. And she said, well, there's a class called Taste of Judaism in San Diego. Go to it and see how you feel. So I started out at the Reformed temple called Temple Emmanuel, and I felt like I'd come home. It was just the nicest place. Everybody was nice to me. I just loved it. So I took a long time to convert, a lot of lessons, a lot of writing, a lot of rewriting and rewriting. And then another girl who was going through the same thing, and I went up to the mikvah in LA, and we did that. And then we had our little ceremony. It was very nice. And then about 2 years later, we had an opportunity to have a bat mitzvah class of all middle-aged women who hadn't done it when they were kids or who were converts. And so it was wonderful, you know, and I'm very proud. My husband, who passed away about a year ago, was Catholic, and we refer to him as a marrying and bearing Catholic because all we went to was weddings and funerals. And but he was very supportive of me, and I think basically he treated me like he wanted to be treated, and that's all that mattered.
And how long were you married?
34 years.
So I'm just inquiring about this transition. So when did you actually convert?
2009.
So 2009 was the conversion, and you began the process 10 years before that?
About 4 years before that.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah, it took a lot of writing, and there were probably 5 people going through the same thing. And in our class of Introduction to Judaism, we started out with like 18 people, and many of them were there because they had to go to a class before they could get married. And most of them dropped out. I think there were 4 of us by the end. And one was the other girl that went with me to the mikvah. But you know, it's a long process, and there's something that they say about they need to turn you down 3 times. Well, I felt like the rabbi turned me down many times. He really put a lot of stumbling blocks in my way, but I finally finished, and I'm happy.
Beautiful. Well, I'll tell you real quick, Sharon. I mean, follow-up question, like at the White House press corps. Got a follow-up question. Here's a good example of how difficult for any of us to change our stripes. It's hard. Look, you had this inkling for decades, and then even when you thought you would do it, you still didn't do it. Once you started, it was only 4 years, which is not a long time. So that's kind of cool. But so each of us, whatever our upbringing is, whatever our culture, it's not so easy to make a transition to a different culture, different religion. And I applaud you for staying the course and keeping in mind your roots. Because if you were a Marana, the Jews of Spain, hiding your Judaism, you actually were Jewish, and then at some point your conversion was an act of to save your lives, your ancestors' lives. Sorry, Sharon, go for it.
Well, I wanted to applaud Mary for her for her gumption and her strength and to going on. They made it difficult for you. I don't know what branch of Judaism you belong to, but I'm interested to hear that, because I know with Rabbi Barry and Va-Dor, he makes it much easier to do that conversion, maybe too easy. And you wouldn't have to go through as much, and possibly because you went through so much, many of those 18 people dropped off because of that, because it was too much for them.
Yeah.
And why make it so difficult? Yeah, learning is fun, and it should be exciting, and it should be something you want to do, and a commitment. And I applaud you 100% for committing for 4 years to your life to doing that. That's fantastic. I think it's fantastic, but I don't think it should be that difficult to make that transition, because it puts off so many people that we could bring into the fold as well.
Mhm.
Ron?
While I agree with Sharon 100%, I believe that the concept is that you are accepted if you prove that you truly, truly want it. And that's why there's the concept of coming back 3 times and all that goes with that. So from a practical standpoint, no one can disagree with Sharon. But we also have to understand where this thought process and difficulty originated from.
Stanley?
Well, slightly different. I happened to be talking to the rabbi this morning. He was all excited about this parsha because it talked about women's rights, which, based on what we talked about this evening, seems like a light touch more than a heavy.
I'll pop it in a second. We'll get to it.
Okay. And he was all excited because this Friday at the Mariposa, he would be talking about, of course, the women's rights, tying in with the lawsuit that Va-Dor approved, of which he's expanded upon. Now, I find, based on what we saw this evening so far, more talk about intermarriage and conversion than anything else concerning women or women's rights.
Well, good. I'm going to ask Sharon. I had sent her some information earlier today. So here we are. The post-mortem, I'm going to ask her to send it out to the listserv, because you are going to hear Rabbi Barry talk about it on Friday. At the very beginning of the clips I gave a video. It's a 4-minute video, a synopsis. The video exclusively talks about the women's rights. That's like 90% of it is about the women's rights. So basically, we'll talk about it right here for a few moments. So basically, Zelophehad died, and the way that the inheritance was all about, that the inheritance could only go to the men. And the daughter said, screw that. We're not standing for that. Please, can you intercede and make a change? Moses goes to God. God says, yeah, sure. I think it's a good idea. And so they amend the narrative. The catch was that if they married somebody, in order for that to stand, they had to marry somebody within their own tribe. They couldn't marry outside the tribe if they wanted to hang on to their property, which was still a huge change by itself. So, but having said that, if I was to channel Rabbi Barry for a moment, here we are with this situation with the abortion rights issue. Women are taken out of the conversation with standing. You've got, for the most part, men on the court dictating to the women of the country what should go down. And it's like same old, same old. So if in the Torah there's this little window of light for women's rights, apparently there's a segment of society today that hasn't got the memo. And so you're welcome to jump in and share. So what is it we do as Americans, as progressive Americans, as Jews? What do we do to inform the political process? Even in Florida, mind you, we have this backward thinking. It's not like it's just the Supreme Court in other places. It's right here in Florida. And which is specifically what Rabbi Barry's lawsuit's addressing. So it's really frightening the ignorance. And I'll make one little comment and you guys could jump in. Even if I wanted to put myself in the shoes of these quote unquote zealous right to lifers, quote unquote, whatever that means, I see a disconnect because I don't see the same sense of outrage with what's going on with these assault weapons and how free people get guns, and they don't seem, if they're concerned about life, why would an entity yet to take its first breath have more standing than a child in elementary school? Anyway.
Very good point.
Great point.
sure.
It's a great
Amen.
point, Andy.
You know, there's a gross hypocrisy, is what I'm saying. So what I want to say to Mary, and I suppose Sharon has your email. Mary, one of the things
No, I
Sharon
don't.
asked you, what denomination were you converted under?
Reform.
Reform. Okay, gotcha. Now you do know, Mary, back to what Ron was saying and whatnot, that in Israel, your conversion will not be recognized by the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Not even conservative for that matter. So, but I like, I still applaud you. But there's other rabbis. Have you read Rami Shapiro? Have you read Lawrence Kushner?
Yeah.
And Arthur Green? I mean, there's all sorts of great rabbis to read. Yeah. So I've got, books to recommend. Anyway, Ron.
I get the impression from the story that Mary told us that she originally came from Sephardic Jews. And if that's the case, I find it rather offensive that she was given such a hard time, because she should have been welcomed to where she was in the first place.
Absolutely.
Good point. She could have got like the fast pass at Disney World.
I'm not sure that the rabbi ever asked me why I was there. I don't know that he ever knew that my grandmother appeared very much to be Jewish, even though she was a very devout Catholic, because that's the way they survived, in Central America. Her family went first to Ecuador and then to Panama. And I still have a lot of cousins in Panama and that sort of thing. But within my father's side of the family, where my grandmother came from, I have 3 cousins that grew up in a Jewish family. My father's sister married a Jewish man in El Salvador. And then I have 3 boy cousins that I have no idea if they ever went to church. And then in my family, I have a brother and a sister, and my sister doesn't go, and my brother married a Catholic girl. And so, it's kind of a mishmash, but I did what I needed to do for me. And I felt very good about it. I still feel good about it. And it's kind of like a new identity for me. There were little things that my grandmother did that were definitely Sephardic, but I don't think she knew it. I think her family had probably been Catholic from 1492. So, and that's how they survived. So.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to throw out an interesting little description. Passover is an interesting holiday when you discuss Ashkenazic Jews versus Sephardic. And one of the talking points is the eating of rice. Sephardim could have rice. Ashkenazim stay away from that. It kind of puffs up. So from that, I gleaned that we shouldn't have things that puff up. Popcorn, whatever. So, but
Gotcha.
early on, I said, early on when I was in college or thereafter, I said, oh, if rice is good enough for Sephardim, it's good enough for me. But then I decided that the rubric for me, the more important rubric, was the puffing up. And I decided no rice, but I observed Pesach for only 7 days, like they do in Israel, because this extra day is the galut, the diaspora, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, it's onerous enough to sacrifice all that. So, but I do feel that maybe we shouldn't have the rice. But obviously the rice was a staple of the diet, so on and so forth. But, the reason why I share my ruminations is because as progressive Jews, we have options. We can choose to embrace our tradition. There's a line from Reconstructionist Judaism. Tradition gets a vote, but not a veto. And that opens up the world to checking out the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Jewish Renewal, and you can meld your own amalgam of Judaism and feel really good about it. And it's all good. So on that note, we've got another minute or two. Anybody else want to share?
Rabbi, I was just going to say the hard part with rice, even if you do eat rice, it's almost impossible to find kosher for Passover rice. It can't have any coating on it, like none of the vitamin spray and all that type of stuff. So it's really hard. I had it year before last. I couldn't find any last year, so I didn't have it last year. I live about 2.5 hours from, or 3.5 hours from Memphis, which is where I would do my kosher, my Passover shopping and so forth. But I too am a convert, and I just applaud Miss Mary. I think a lot of what she said is so touching and so special. And I remember one question that my rabbi asked me when and as far as I know, I don't have any Jewish roots. But when I went, he said, there's 2 reasons people convert. One is for marriage, and 2 is I'm about to cry now. It's just very touching. The fact that they have a Jewish soul. And that just meant so much to me. And so now when we talk about all of us standing at Mount Sinai, I can include myself and so forth. So I think that's all I can say.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Real quick, one of my sons, I visited him. He actually did a Teach for America stint in Marvel, Arkansas. So
Yes.
how far is that from where you live?
Oh gosh, probably I think that's down south if I'm not mistaken. So that would probably be a couple hours.
Okay. Well, real quick,
I'm up at the top part of the state.
I actually flew into Memphis and I was with him for 3 days and I flew out of Little Rock.
Okay, yeah.
All right, last call. Anybody closing comments? Harris is going to sing.
No, I just want to mention that when I graduated high school in 1953, it was a very large graduating class, maybe 300 people. All the Jewish girls married Jewish guys. And today, everything changes. So half the Jews are marrying Goyim or Gentiles, and who knows, but the only thing that counts is a good marriage.
That's right. That's right. A good neshama. Yeah, that's right. A good neshama. So on that, I want to thank everybody once again for your beautiful spirit. And I'll tell you, thank you, Dr. Brooks and Mary and all of you. Jeff is hailing, I think, from Boston. Dr. Brooks from Arkansas, Mary from San Diego. The rest of us are local yokels. and I will be here next week, same time, same channel. And I'll have Sharon send out. She'll send out what I sent her. Up near the top is that video, 4 minutes about the women's rights. You'll appreciate it.
Thank you all for attending tonight.
Much.
We really appreciate it. Have a great week and shalom.
Shalom.